In front of Buckingham Palace, the memorial dedicated to Queen Victoria reminds us of the England of the past, where during her reign, Britain was the ruling industrial, military, and commercial force of the globe. Just after the Napoleonic Wars, the country profited from an era of peace that permitted it to devote itself entirely to the Industrial Revolution and becoming the most important industrialized nation in the world. This Industrial Revolution that favored science and business allowed for the emergence of a rich middle class that, thanks to the Great Reform Bill passed in 1832, shared political power that up until then had been an aristocratic prerogative. It is during this period of economic, scientific, and political flowering that the 18-year-old Victoria became queen of the greatest industrial, naval, and financial power on earth. Victoria ascended to the throne the same year that a 24-year-old parliamentary journalist published a serial novel that became an instant success. The Pickwick Papers was an astounding literary debut for Charles Dickens, the most popular writer of his time, and considered by some to be one of the greatest British writers, on a level with Shakespeare.
If it hadn't been for Pickwick Papers, which made him famous almost overnight, I would never have been born, and therefore Pickwick Papers to me is incredibly important. He was 24, he was beginning to write short stories, he was a political journalist. Pickwick Papers was the very first book that he ever wrote. It was written every month, another 3 chapters were written. That is, it was the first time any new book had ever been written like that. So he was the inventor, because of Pickwick, of the paperback. He was the inventor of the soap opera, because he left everybody at the 3rd chapter waiting to find out what happened. So they'd have to buy the next part. But they weren't selling very well. Only 400 copies every month were sold. And that's not very much. It doesn't pay for all it's worth. So the publishers should have said, cut. But they didn't. How he kept the publishers publishing his books, and all he said was, okay, fine, we will cut the pictures to 2, I will double the number of words, and you'll pay me more. Now, he didn't alter the number of copies of Pickwick being sold. Pickwick couldn't do it. It was when Sam Weller came in. Sam Weller was the servant to Mr. Pickwick, a Cockney, and Cockney speak funny English. And he came in, and from 400 copies each month, they sold up to 40,000.
So it was that England's greatest queen began her reign at the same time that Britain's greatest novelist began his career. Dickens' writing constitutes an exceptional witness to his age. More, his incisive and moving criticism of the inequalities of Victorian society would give birth to a new phenomenon, a social conscience. For even as the Industrial Revolution mechanized the entire country, leading to prosperity unprecedented in history, the cost of this progress was a radical difference between rich and poor. Members of the city and businessmen working to build financial empires formed a social elite in the West End. They began to imitate the aristocracy, educating their sons in the right schools and expecting their wives and daughters to spend their leisure time at high society gatherings. For example, at a ball, the guests were subject to a very strict code of conduct, the respecting of which confirmed their status as a lady or a gentleman. Men were expected to wear black trousers, vest, and jacket, with a white shirt and tie. As for women, they were to wear white dresses and their most beautiful jewels, while avoiding low necklines. They were to be accompanied by a chaperone, who undertook to see that her protégé did not commit a social gaffe that would sully her reputation. Physical contact between ladies and gentlemen was judged unworthy. Good manners demanded that both sexes reserve the expression of their emotions for flowers, dogs, and horses. Created by Queen Anne nearly 300 years ago, the royal races at Ascot are still important today. It is there that you can see the measure of importance the British people and gentry still attach to the royal family and its traditions. For the 4 days that the racing meet lasts, the crowd is welcome to observe the traditional royal procession along the 6 kilometers that separate Windsor Castle from Ascot. For the lower classes, confined to a reserved area of the clubhouse, this procession and these races offer the opportunity to watch celebrities and royalty at close range. They watch them showing off in the royal enclosure. One can clearly see the division that still separates the gentry and the lower classes. Aristocratic phlegm and reserve contrast with the cheer and rowdiness of the boisterous crowd. The Ascot meet remains a living tableau of Victorian manners. If Dickens abundantly described the way of life of this elite middle class which he belonged to, he was one of the few who was sensitive to the miserable fate reserved for the working masses in the capital. Attracted by industrial activity, people from the English countryside and many Irish fleeing the rampant starvation in their homeland moved to London. However, the city simply lacked the necessary resources to absorb this human tide. So it was that Charles Dickens lived practically his whole life in a city where the sewers and the open-air cesspools spread their miasma in the polluted air. The stench of the dead rose from city ossuaries. 50% of children under 5 died from malnutrition or disease. Life expectancy was 40 for the middle classes. It was only 22 for the working class. When my friend, the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, came to visit us, I decided to take him to see the slums. I remember that Forster, my future biographer, and Maclise, the painter who just completed a portrait of me that I like, accompanied us on our expedition. I took them through narrow alleys, dead ends, and back streets. I wanted to see a tenement. The neighborhood was overcrowded with people living in poorly constructed buildings, with no ventilation and no bathrooms. In certain places, excrement was spread about in the rooms, hallways, basements, and courtyards with such density and thickness that it became almost impossible to move. The normal stench of this zone of theft and vice was such that my poor friend Maclise fell ill. And when I think that when Oliver Twist was published, I was accused of invention and melodrama. From Oliver Twist, his second novel, onwards, Dickens' social preoccupations are as clear as a watermark in his writings. His commitment towards a greater social equality led many to associate themselves with a more radical political element, the Chartists, who demanded the adoption of a Charter of Rights for the people. The Charter would guarantee the right to vote for men and a secret ballot rather than a show of hands. In any case, Dickens' sensitivity to society's pariahs sprang not from his political convictions, which were rather conservative, but rather from a personal memory of a childhood drama which haunted him all his life. His father, John Dickens, was imprisoned for debt in Marshalsea, and his mother chose to go live with her husband in prison, obliging Charles's younger siblings to accompany her. Charles, at age 10, had to quit school, which he loved, and work for a shoe wax manufacturer. 30 years later, forever marked by the spectacle of misery and wrecked human lives he encountered at Marshalsea, Dickens wrote Little Dorrit, describing the infamous conditions of Victorian jails.
We're now standing in the grounds of what was formerly the Marshalsea prison, which Charles Dickens wrote about in Little Dorrit. It was also known to the inhabitants here as the Marshalsea Clink. And the reason it was called the Clink is because most of the prisoners were enchained, the debtors, and as they walked along their chains would clink, hence the name Clink. There were two types of debtor who would come to this prison. One would be the people who had a certain amount of money, and they would go over to what was called the master's side. As prisons weren't run as prisons as such, whoever ran the prison ran it as a business in terms of how much they could exploit the prisoners for. If you had money, you could come into reasonable accommodation, you could even have a servant. If you were very poor, the ground we were standing on would probably go down 3 or 4 levels. And the very poorest people were kept at the poorest level. And if you owed a sum of money, say £5 or £6, which in the times of Charles Dickens was a substantial amount of money, you had to pay the keeper of the prison to come into the prison. You also had to pay him a fee to leave. So in actual fact, not only did you have to find the £5, you had to find the extras, which would probably be double. And consequently, people stayed in places like this for 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5 years. But when Dickens wrote about it, he wrote exactly as it was. These were awful, dreadful places where they kept people in the most dreadful conditions in the name of civilized society.
With his father out of prison, Charles was able to study again. When he was 18, he taught himself stenography, and 4 years later, he became a reporter for the Morning Chronicle. This was a liberal paper, where he developed the reputation for being the best parliamentary chronicler in London. It was here he published his serial novel, The Pickwick Papers. The success of the Pickwick Papers assured the young journalist's financial future at the age of 24, and it is in this neo-Gothic church, St. Luke of London, that Charles Dickens wed Catherine Hogarth on April 2nd, 1836. She was the daughter of the publisher of the Evening Chronicle. The young couple left for a honeymoon in the southeast region of England, an area the young novelist associated with idyllic childhood memories. With London, it became a source of inspiration for him, and its influence can be found everywhere in his writing. It is here in this old house in Chalk that the young couple began their married life. And it's here, on this hill, that Dickens developed a lifelong love of walking. After long hikes in the marshes of Gravesend, he would stop when he entered the village and raise his hat to salute the strange gargoyle that still decorates the church entrance. It was in this little house in Chatham that Dickens lived the happiest years of his childhood. The market town held a special place in his works. One can find numerous descriptions of it in The Tale of Two Cities and The Uncommercial Traveler. Traveling to visit his Aunt Betsy Trotwood, it's in Chatham that an exhausted and broke David Copperfield was obliged to sell his clothes. For his whole life, Dickens hiked the wild hills of Kent. The countryside, the cemeteries, the hotels and pubs that he found so picturesque can be found in his writing. Visiting the area, one can still follow the peregrinations of the novelist and his characters. It's in Cobham that one finds the old church and cemetery, where Mr. Pickwick and one of his young acolytes circle the graves engrossed in a lively conversation. Just in front, the Leather Bottle was one of Dickens' favorite pubs. Several parts of the Pickwick Papers take place there. Today, the walls of the establishment are covered in caricatures, photos, and various souvenirs evoking the memory of the famous author. In Cooling, these 2 rows of tombstones that tell of the death of 13 children in the same family, all dead before the age of 2, became, in the novelist's mind, the sisters and brothers of his character Pip.